The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door while Sarah Chen was getting her daughters ready for school. She found it after Maya had already spilled cereal on her uniform, and Emma couldn't find her left shoe. The paper was crisp and official, stamped with the county seal, giving her 30 days to vacate the apartment she'd called home for the past 3 years. Sarah stood in the narrow kitchen, the notice trembling slightly in her hands, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion since the divorce. Behind her, Maya asked if they could have pancakes tomorrow. Emma announced she'd found her shoe under the couch. The morning continued around her, oblivious to the fact that their already precarious world had just tilted further toward collapse. She was 34 years old, working 2 jobs that barely covered rent and groceries, with an ex-husband who'd moved to another state and whose child support checks arrived sporadically, if at all. Her savings account held $217. Her credit cards were maxed out from the medical bills when Emma had pneumonia last winter. And now she had 30 days. That night, after the girls were asleep, Sarah sat at her laptop and searched desperately for apartments she could afford. Every listing that fit her budget was either too far from the girls' school, in neighborhoods that made her stomach clench with worry, or had already been rented. The email arrived at 11:43 p.m. The subject line read, "Estate of Helen Chen, Final Assets Distribution." Sarah stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Her grandmother had died 6 months earlier, and Sarah had already received her small inheritance, a check for $800 that had gone immediately toward overdue utility bills. The email was from a law office in Oregon, explaining that Helen Chen had acquired a property through a tax auction in 1987 and held it until her death. As Helen's sole surviving grandchild, Sarah was the designated heir. The lawyer included GPS coordinates, a brief legal description, and a tax bill showing the property was current through the end of the year. The final paragraph made Sarah's breath catch. The assessed value of the property was listed as $1. She clicked on the attached survey map. The property wasn't a small lot. It was over 200 acres of remote terrain in the Cascade Range, hours from any significant town. The boundary lines traced an irregular shape around what the map labeled as Crater Lake Road vicinity, unimproved land. She opened a satellite view and zoomed in. The landscape was stark and otherworldly, a frozen volcanic caldera surrounded by dark rock and sparse vegetation. Snow covered most of the visible terrain. The caldera itself appeared as a deep bowl carved into the mountainside, its walls steep and forbidding. No roads led directly to it. No structures were visible. Sarah read the email again, looking for the catch. But the lawyer's message was straightforward. The property was hers if she wanted it. All she needed to do was sign the transfer documents and accept responsibility for future taxes, which currently amounted to $63 per year. A property worth $1. It meant nothing, really. But Sarah had learned in the past 2 years that nothing was worse than nothing. At least this was something tangible, something she could point to and say she owned, even if it was only a crater full of snow and volcanic rock. She replied to the email, asking for the transfer documents. The conversation with her sister came 3 days later, over the phone while Sarah was on her lunch break. Jennifer had always been the practical one, the successful one, the one who'd married well and lived in a house with an actual backyard. "You inherited what?" Jennifer's voice carried a mix of disbelief and concern. "A property in Oregon. Grandma Helen bought it at a tax auction back in the 80s. How much is it worth now?" Sarah hesitated. "The county assessment says $1. The silence stretched long enough that Sarah checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Sarah." Jennifer's voice had shifted into the tone she used when she was trying very hard to be patient. $1 means it's worthless. It probably means there's something seriously wrong with it. I checked with the lawyer. It's clear, just remote. A volcano. You inherited a volcano that's worth $1, and you're actually considering accepting it? I already accepted it. Sarah, I know things have been difficult, but this isn't the answer. You can't do anything with land like that. Jennifer's voice softened slightly. Look, I know you're stressed about the apartment situation. David and I talked about it. And we can help you with first and last month's rent on a new place. Sarah closed her eyes. Jennifer and David had money. They had stability. They also had opinions about how Sarah should live her life. Taking their money meant accepting their judgment along with it. I appreciate that, Sarah said carefully. But I need to figure this out on my own. By accepting a worthless volcano? By not giving up on every option just because it looks difficult. The call ended badly. Sarah knew Jennifer meant well. She knew the advice was practical. But something in Sarah resisted the neat logic of it. Her life had followed a practical path, and it had all fallen apart anyway. The documents arrived via overnight mail a week later. Sarah signed them at the kitchen table while Maya did homework, and Emma colored a picture of what she insisted was a dragon. The notary at the UPS store looked at the property description and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. That evening, she told the girls about the land. She kept it simple, describing it as a special place their great-grandmother had owned. Emma asked if there were dragons there, since it was a volcano. Maya, more practical at 8 years old, asked if they were going to live there. No, honey, there's no house or anything. It's just land. Then why did great-grandma buy it? Sarah looked at her older daughter, so serious and thoughtful. I don't know. Maybe she saw something in it that other people didn't. The eviction deadline crept closer. Sarah found a smaller apartment on the edge of town. Cheaper, but farther from everything. The landlord required first month, last month, and a security deposit, a total of $2,100 she didn't have. She pulled up the property documents again, studying the coordinates and legal description. 200 acres of volcanic caldera. Unimproved, undeveloped, worthless. Or was it? The idea came slowly, reluctantly, half-formed, and probably foolish. If the land was truly hers, maybe there was something there worth more than $1. Volcanic rock had uses. Landscaping, maybe. Construction aggregate. If she could extract even a small amount of marketable material, it might be enough to cover the deposit. Sarah called the lawyer in Oregon. She explained that she wanted to visit the property, to assess it in person. The lawyer sounded faintly surprised. It's remote, he warned. You'll need a vehicle with good clearance. Cell service is unreliable. But I can access it? Legally? It's your property, Ms. Chen. You can do whatever you want with it. Sarah booked a rental SUV for the following weekend. The cost made her stomach turn, but she told herself it was an investment. When she told Jennifer about the plan, her sister's response was immediate. You're going to drive 8 hours each way to look at a frozen crater that the entire state of Oregon has decided is worthless. Do you hear yourself? I need to see it with my own eyes. You need to focus on finding an apartment you can actually afford, not chase after some fantasy. It's not a fantasy, it's due diligence. It's desperation. Jennifer's voice softened slightly. Take our help. Let us loan you the deposit money. And what happens when I'm not on my feet? When does the loan become a debt I can never repay? The conversation ended badly. Sarah knew she was being stubborn, but something in her refused to give up on the idea that she could solve this herself. The night before she left, Sarah sat with the girls. Her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had agreed to watch them. Emma cried and asked why she couldn't come too. Maya stayed quiet, her face set in that serious expression that made her look far older than 8. Is it because of the eviction? Maya asked, after Emma had finally gone to bed. Sarah looked at her daughter, startled. "You know about that?" "I saw the paper. I can read." "Yes, honey. I'm trying to find a way to make things better. By looking at a volcano? By looking at something that might help us." Maya nodded slowly. "Okay. But you'll come back?" "Of course I'll come back." "Promise?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the weight of that question, the fear beneath it. "I promise. Nothing could keep me away from you and your sister." She left at dawn on Friday, driving east through California and into Oregon as the sun rose over the mountains. By midday, she was navigating 2-lane highways that curved through dense forest. The GPS directed her onto progressively smaller roads. Paved gave way to gravel, then to dirt. After an hour on the dirt road, the GPS announced she was approaching her destination. There was nothing obvious, just a gap between trees that might have once been a road, but had long since been reclaimed. She grabbed her backpack, locked the SUV, and started walking. After 40 minutes of hiking, the trees began to thin. The ground grew rockier, darker. And then the forest ended abruptly, and Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the caldera. The crater spread before her like a wound carved into the mountain, a vast circular depression surrounded by jagged walls of black volcanic rock. The bottom was far below, perhaps 300 feet down, partially covered with snow and ice. The scale was overwhelming. For the first time since receiving the eviction notice, Sarah felt something other than panic or desperation. Standing at the edge of this frozen crater, she felt a strange sense of possibility. Her life had been reduced to spreadsheets and impossible equations. Here, none of that mattered. She walked slowly along the rim, studying the rock formations. The volcanic stone was dark, almost black, with a glassy quality where it had cooled quickly. In some places, the surface caught the light and threw it back with unexpected brilliance. As she rounded the eastern edge of the crater, something caught her eye. A break in the uniformity of the rock face, a darker shadow that suggested depth. She moved closer and realized she was looking at an opening in the crater wall. Not a cave exactly, but a crevice. The descent into the crater was difficult. The slope was steep and covered with loose rock. Sarah picked her way down slowly, testing each step. The crevice was about halfway down the crater wall, a narrow split in the rock about 6 feet tall. She hesitated. This was foolish. She was alone in a remote location, about to enter an unmapped space. But she'd driven 8 hours and spent money she couldn't afford. Turning back now felt like admitting defeat. Sarah took a deep breath and entered the crevice. The passage was narrow but navigable. She moved forward slowly, sweeping her phone's flashlight beam ahead of her. After about 20 feet, the passage widened and the ceiling rose higher. The temperature dropped further. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber, and Sarah stopped so abruptly that she nearly lost her balance. The walls glittered. Sarah stepped forward, raising her light higher, and the entire chamber came alive with reflected brilliance. The walls were covered in obsidian. Volcanic glass formed when lava cooled rapidly. But this wasn't the rough, chunky obsidian she'd seen in rock shops. These were sheets of it, smooth panels of glossy black stone shot through with iridescent patterns that shifted as her light moved across them. Some sections appeared deep blue, others showed hints of green or purple, colors trapped in the glass like frozen rainbows. She walked closer, reaching out to touch the nearest wall. The surface was cool and perfectly smooth. The obsidian here wasn't just decorative quality. It was flawless, the kind of material she'd seen once in an expensive gallery, selling for hundreds of dollars for a piece the size of her hand. And this chamber was filled with it. Walls covered floor to ceiling, pillars of it rising from the ground. curtains of it hanging where cooling lava had dripped and frozen. Sarah's hands began to shake. She walked deeper into the chamber, her flashlight revealing more and more of the extraordinary space. In the far corner, massive formations of obsidian had grown in twisted, organic shapes. Each one was worth more than she made in a month, just sitting here in the darkness, untouched and unknown. She found a boulder and sat down hard. This wasn't a small deposit of decorative stone. This was a fortune in volcanic glass, hidden inside a crater that the entire county of Oregon had decided was worth exactly $1. Sarah thought about the eviction notice, about her sister's pitying tone, about her grandmother who'd bought this property and held it for nearly 40 years without ever mentioning it. Had Helen known? Had she discovered this chamber and kept it secret? Or had she simply believed that something worthless to everyone else might one day prove valuable to someone who needed it? The worthless crater had just revealed itself as anything but worthless. And Sarah Chen, evicted single mother, suddenly owned something that might change everything, if she could figure out how to claim it. The walk back to the SUV felt different. Sarah moved quickly, her mind racing, already building plans. The obsidian chamber was potentially transformative, but potential meant nothing without execution, and execution required resources she didn't have. She reached the SUV just as the sun dropped below the tree line. Sarah sat in the driver's seat, staring at nothing, while her hand slowly stopped shaking. The practical part of her brain began asserting itself. First, she couldn't tell anyone yet. Not Jennifer, not her lawyer. The moment word got out that there was value in this property, it would stop being hers in any meaningful sense. Lawyers would appear. County officials would question the assessment. Second, she needed to understand exactly what she had. The obsidian was clearly valuable, but how valuable? How much was there? Third, she needed a plan for development that wouldn't attract attention until she was ready. Mining permits, environmental assessments, all of it created paper trails. She'd need to move carefully. Sarah started the engine and began the long drive back toward Portland. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. The girls were fine, already in bed. Another text arrived, from Jennifer. "Call me when you get back. David and I talked and we can help with the deposit and first month if needed. No rush to pay back." Sarah stared at the message. 12 hours ago, she would have felt the weight of obligation. Now, with the memory of that obsidian chamber fresh in her mind, she felt something different. Not quite confidence, but something like possibility. She typed back, "Thank you. I appreciate it. Let me think about it a bit." The drive to Portland took longer than the trip out had. Sarah stopped twice to rest, each time seeing the glittering walls of the chamber in her mind. She reached Portland by midnight and checked into a cheap motel. She set her alarm for 6 a.m., giving herself time to visit the county assessor's office when it opened. The county assessor's office was a bland government building. Sarah arrived 15 minutes after opening and was directed to a desk where a woman in her 50s regarded her with weary patience. "I need information about a property," Sarah said, sliding the deed across the desk. "I recently inherited it." The woman typed something into her computer. "Cascade Range parcel. Acquired tax sale 1987. Current assessed value $1. Zoned resource preservation with limited development rights." Sarah's stomach tightened. What does resource preservation mean exactly? It means the county has determined the property has environmental or geological significance that limits commercial development. You can own it, you can visit it, but large-scale construction or industrial activity requires environmental review and permits. What about small-scale extraction? If I wanted to remove some volcanic rock for personal use, how much rock? I don't know yet. Probably not a lot. The woman shrugged. Under 5 tons annually, you'd probably be fine with just a county permit. Gets complicated quickly above that. She glanced at the property location. You'd also need access approval since there's no existing road. But it's possible? Legally? Everything's possible if you fill out enough forms. The woman's expression softened slightly. Most people who own these remote parcels don't bother with permits. Who's going to check? Sarah thanked her and left, her mind churning. The Obsidian chamber changed everything, but it didn't change the legal restrictions. She couldn't just back up a truck and start loading valuable stone. She needed permits, access, equipment. And all of that required money and time she didn't have, unless she did it quietly. The property was remote enough that no one would notice small-scale extraction. If she could access the Obsidian carefully, removing only what she could carry, selling it privately through channels that didn't ask questions, she could generate income without triggering scrutiny. It wasn't illegal, exactly. The rock was hers. She'd just be exercising her property rights in a way that avoided bureaucratic complications. She drove to a hardware store and bought heavy-duty gloves, a small pry bar, a rock hammer, and 2 canvas bags. The total came to $73, money she couldn't afford to spend. But it was an investment. Back in the motel room, Sarah began researching Obsidian markets. She learned that volcanic glass varied wildly in value. Common black obsidian sold for a few dollars per pound, but high-quality specimens with unusual coloring, especially large pieces, could command hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The obsidian she'd seen, with its iridescent blue and purple sheens, definitely fell into the premium category. She needed someone who could buy it without asking too many questions about provenance. She found several online communities dedicated to rockhounding. Sarah created an anonymous account and lurked through threads, noting which users bought premium volcanic glass. By evening, she'd identified 3 potential contacts who seemed comfortable with transactions that didn't involve official paperwork. Sarah returned home Sunday evening. Emma ran to her immediately. Maya hung back, studying her mother's face. "Did you find anything?" Maya asked. Sarah thought about the glittering chamber, about the tools now hidden in her trunk. "I found something interesting. I'll tell you about it once I understand it better." After the girls were in bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the eviction notice and her laptop. 26 days remaining. Jennifer's offer sat in her messages. The safe choice. Sarah opened a new browser tab and navigated back to the rockhounding forums. One user stood out, Volcanic Collector, who posted regularly about high-end obsidian and lived in the Pacific Northwest. She drafted a message carefully. "I've recently acquired access to a private property with high-quality obsidian formations. Rainbow sheen, large panels, excellent clarity. Would you be interested in seeing samples?" The response came within 20 minutes. "Always interested in premium material." "What region?" Sarah typed back. "Cascade Range. I can provide 8/10 samples initially." "Send photos." "I can provide photos of extracted samples. Not comfortable photographing the source location yet." A longer pause. Then, "Understood. But I'll need to see the material in person. Location to meet?" They settled on a coffee shop in Portland, neutral territory. Saturday morning, 1 week from now. She closed the laptop and stared at the eviction notice. 26 days. Now she had a plan, however fragile. It required another trip to Oregon, another extraction, and a meeting with a stranger. But it was a plan, and it was hers. Jennifer called Wednesday evening. "So, have you thought more about our offer?" "I'm still considering options." "What options?" The brightness faded. "Sarah, you have 3 weeks left. I appreciate the offer. But I need a little more time. Time for what? To drive back to Oregon and stare at your worthless volcano some more? The call ended badly. Sarah sat in the kitchen afterward, feeling the familiar weight of her sister's judgment. But something in her refused to give up. She left Friday before dawn. Mrs. Rodriguez took the girls again. The drive felt longer this time, weighted by expectation. The first visit had been exploration. This was extraction. She parked in the same spot and began the hike with her new backpack and tools. The temperature had dropped, patches of fresh snow dotting the ground. Her fingers were numb by the time she reached the crater's edge. The obsidian chamber waited exactly as she'd left it. Sarah stood at the entrance for a long moment, overwhelmed by what she was about to do. She entered and set up methodically. The new flashlight revealed details she'd missed. The obsidian wasn't uniformly distributed. Some areas showed solid sheets, others were more fractured. Sarah focused on the fractured sections. The rock hammer worked better than expected. The obsidian was hard but brittle, fracturing cleanly. She worked slowly, careful to avoid sounds that might echo. The broken pieces ranged from fist-sized chunks to larger slabs nearly a foot across. All showed that distinctive iridescent sheen. By mid-morning, she'd filled one canvas bag with premium specimens. She photographed several pieces, careful to disable location services first. Sarah was reaching for another promising chunk when her flashlight caught something unexpected. Behind the fractured section, the chamber wall showed a different texture. She moved closer and realized she was looking at an opening, a passage leading deeper into the rock. Her heart rate spiked. She'd assumed the chamber was isolated, but this suggested something more complex. Sarah checked her phone. Just past noon. She had hours of daylight remaining, and she'd already collected enough samples. She aimed her flashlight into the passage and began moving forward. The tunnel was narrower, forcing her to turn sideways in places. The temperature dropped noticeably. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a second chamber, smaller but no less remarkable. This space was dome-shaped, and covering nearly every surface were obsidian formations, unlike anything she'd seen. These weren't sheets or panels. They were structures, columns of volcanic glass rising like frozen fountains. Delicate curtains hanging from the ceiling. Some formations were as thin as her finger, translucent. Others were massive pillars. She moved through the space slowly, documenting everything. The chamber felt sacred, untouched by time. At the far end, Sarah discovered a third passage, taller and wider, with smooth walls showing water erosion. She followed it cautiously. The passage descended at a steeper angle and opened into what could only be described as a cavern. The scale shocked her. This was an underground space easily 100 feet across, with a ceiling so high her flashlight couldn't reach it. And everywhere, obsidian caught and reflected her light. Massive slabs of volcanic glass lay scattered across the floor, some intact, others shattered into countless fragments. Sarah stood in the center and slowly rotated. The main chamber had been impressive, but this was different. This was a treasure trove of premium obsidian, enough to supply collectors for years. The $1 property wasn't just valuable, it was potentially worth millions. Sarah forced herself to take steady breaths, the cold air burning her lungs as she tried to process what she was seeing. The scale of obsidian before her defied everything she'd understood about the property, about her inheritance, about what was possible. She pulled out her phone and began taking systematic photographs, documenting the cavern from every angle she could reach. The flash illuminated sections that her flashlight couldn't, revealing even more formations tucked into alcoves and corners she hadn't initially noticed. As she worked her way around the perimeter, stepping carefully over fallen slabs and avoiding the sharper fragments that littered the floor, Sarah began to understand the geology of what had happened here. This wasn't just a single chamber formed by a gas bubble and cooling lava. This was a complex system, possibly formed over multiple eruptions, with each volcanic event adding layers of obsidian in different concentrations and qualities. The rainbow sheen that characterized the most valuable pieces appeared in specific zones, suggesting that particular chemical conditions during cooling had created the iridescent effect. She knelt beside one of the massive slabs that had fallen from the ceiling, running her gloved hand along its smooth surface. The obsidian here was at least 6 inches thick, a solid panel of volcanic glass that would be nearly impossible to extract intact, but that could yield dozens of smaller pieces if carefully worked. The edges where it had fractured showed the characteristic conchoidal pattern, the shell-like curves that made obsidian so distinctive and so useful to ancient peoples who had fashioned it into cutting tools. But this obsidian had never been worked by ancient hands. The formations here had been sealed away since their creation, untouched by the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the region for thousands of years, unknown to the settlers who had later claimed the land, invisible to the county assessors who had valued the property at $1. Only the Cascade Mining Company had found it, had recognized its value, and had apparently chosen to keep it secret rather than exploit it immediately. Why? The question nagged at Sarah as she continued her documentation. The 1920s were boom times for decorative stone and novelty geological materials. If the company had publicized this discovery, they could have attracted investors, secured financing, developed the site properly. Instead, they'd hidden their art in wooden crates and sealed it away in the most remote chamber they could access, then apparently walked away from it all. The 1924 fire that destroyed their warehouse made more sense now. If the company had already moved their most valuable pieces to the crater for safekeeping, the fire would have destroyed only their remaining inventory and equipment. But why not return afterward? Why default on taxes decades later and let the property slip away? Sarah thought about the era, about what she knew of the 1920s and 1930s, the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression that followed, banks failing, businesses collapsing, fortunes evaporating overnight. Perhaps the Cascade Mining Company had intended to wait out some temporary difficulty, had hidden their assets expecting to return within months or years, and then been swept away by economic forces beyond their control. The individuals who knew about the chambers might have died, been scattered, or simply lost the ability to reclaim what they'd hidden, and so it had waited. Through the Depression, through World War II, through decades of changing ownership as the property bounced between tax auctions and brief private holdings, always reverting back to the county when nobody could see sufficient value to justify even minimal tax payments. Until Helen Chen had bought it in 1987 and held it year after year, through economic booms and recessions, through family changes and personal losses, maintaining the tiny tax obligation without explanation or apparent purpose. Had Helen known? The question consumed Sarah as she completed her circuit of the cavern. The chambers weren't marked on any map, weren't mentioned in any document Sarah had found. But Helen had held the property for 30 years without selling, without development, without even visiting as far as Sarah knew. That kind of patience suggested either extraordinary faith in hidden value or actual knowledge of what lay beneath the frozen crater. Sarah's phone showed she'd been in the chambers for nearly 4 hours. The battery was draining rapidly in the cold, and she still needed to climb back out before full darkness made the ascent dangerous. But she couldn't bring herself to leave yet. Every direction she looked revealed new details, new formations, new possibilities. She moved to the center of the cavern and slowly rotated, trying to estimate the total volume of premium obsidian visible just in this one space. Hundreds of cubic feet, certainly, possibly thousands. Even accounting for waste during extraction and processing, even assuming she could only access a fraction of what she saw, the raw material value was staggering. And that didn't account for the carved pieces still waiting in the sealed chamber, or the potential for finding more crates elsewhere in the system, or the possibility that other chambers existed deeper in the mountain, the $1 property. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The county assessors who had assigned that value had probably never left their offices, had certainly never descended into the crater, had made their determination based purely on location, lack of access, and absence of obvious development potential. They'd applied the same bureaucratic logic that governed all their assessments, reducing complex reality to simple categories and monetary values. Remote volcanic formation, no structures, no utilities, resource preservation zoning, therefore worthless. They couldn't have been more wrong if they'd tried. But their wrongness had protected this place, had kept it hidden and undeveloped, had prevented the kind of commercial exploitation that would have stripped these chambers bare decades ago. The worthlessness had been a kind of camouflage, making the property invisible to anyone who thought in conventional terms about value and utility. Sarah checked her phone one more time and made a decision. She'd return to extract samples from the main chamber as planned, but she wouldn't touch anything in this cavern yet. Not until she understood the full legal situation, not until she had proper equipment and expertise, not until she could do this right. The Obsidian had waited millions of years to be discovered, and a century since the Cascade Mining Company had last been here. It could wait a few more weeks while she figured out how to proceed without destroying either the geological formations or her own chance at benefiting from them. She made her way back through the passages, moving more quickly now that she knew the route, her mind already racing ahead to the challenges that waited above ground. The extraction of samples would be straightforward enough, a few premium pieces to prove the quality to potential buyers, nothing that would attract attention or suggest the true scale of what lay hidden. But the carved sculptures presented a more complex problem. They were clearly valuable, clearly historical, and clearly at risk if she left them in place while word of the discovery spread. Sarah thought about the ethics of what she was planning. Taking the sculptures meant removing artifacts from an archaeological context without documentation, without expert supervision, without any of the careful procedures that preserved historical information, along with physical objects. Every archaeologist she'd ever heard of would be horrified. But leaving them meant trusting that she could maintain control of the site long enough to do things properly. And Sarah's experience with bureaucracy suggested that trust would be misplaced. The moment she filed for proper permits, the moment she contacted state agencies or academic institutions, the decision-making would shift out of her hands. Committees would form, studies would be commissioned, regulations would be interpreted and reinterpreted. The process could take months or years, during which her daughters would be evicted. Her financial crisis would deepen, and her ability to maintain any control over the property would evaporate. The system was designed for people with resources and time. She had neither. So she'd take the sculptures. 6 of them, small enough to transport, valuable enough to solve her immediate problems. She'd document their location, photograph them in place, create a record that could be used later if circumstances allowed for proper archaeological work. But she'd take them, sell them, use the money to secure her family's basic needs. And then, once she had breathing room and stability, she'd figure out how to do right by the history and the geology and the legal complexities. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't what her grandmother would probably have advised if Helen had been the kind of person who gave advice. But it was practical. And Sarah had learned over the past 2 years that survival sometimes required prioritizing the possible over the perfect. She could feel guilty about it later, when her daughters had a roof over their heads and food in the cupboard. For now, she needed to focus on execution. The climb back to the crater's surface seemed longer than the descent, her legs burning from the exertion, her backpack heavy with the raw obsidian samples she'd collected. By the time she emerged into the late afternoon light, her clothes were damp with sweat despite the cold, and her hands trembled from a combination of physical exhaustion and emotional overload. Sarah stood at the rim of the crater and looked back down into its depths, trying to reconcile the stark, frozen landscape visible from above with the glittering treasure hidden within. From here, nothing suggested value or significance, just black rock and patches of snow, a geological curiosity in a remote location, worth exactly what the county had assessed. $1. But she knew different now. She knew what lay beneath the surface, what waited in chambers that had kept their secrets for a century. And that knowledge changed everything. Her financial prospects, her relationship to the property, her understanding of her grandmother's choices, her sense of what was possible. The hike back to the SUV felt different than the morning's approach. Sarah moved with purpose now, no longer exploring but executing a plan. She had samples to sell, sculptures to extract, buyers to find, decisions to make. The desperation that had driven her to Oregon still pressed against her chest, but it was joined now by something else: determination, possibility, the first fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, she could solve this herself. As the forest closed around her and the crater disappeared from view behind the ridge, Sarah pulled out her phone. Still no signal, but that would come once she reached the main road. And then she'd begin the next phase: research, outreach, careful steps toward transforming geological wealth into the practical resources that would keep her daughters safe. The $1 property was about to prove its true worth. Sarah just had to be smart enough, careful enough, and yes, lucky enough to claim it. The realization hit her like physical force. Sarah sat down abruptly, her legs unable to support her. She'd come looking for enough to cover a security deposit. Instead, she'd discovered something that could transform her entire life. But the scale brought new complications. She couldn't simply remove samples and sell them quietly. This required planning, infrastructure, legal protections she didn't have. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She needed to be smart, patient, strategic. Take small steps. Keep everything quiet until she was positioned to protect what she'd found. As she completed her circuit of the cavern, Sarah noticed something that made her stop. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a formation, was another passage. This one was different, more regular in shape, with walls showing subtle tool marks. Not natural. Carved. Sarah approached slowly. Tool marks meant human activity. Someone had been here before, had deliberately enlarged this passage. But when? And why? The passage led upward, a steep incline requiring her to use her hands. After about 30 feet, it opened into a final space that stole her remaining breath. This chamber was smaller, but far more finished. The walls had been deliberately smoothed, the ceiling reinforced with old timber beams, and stacked against one wall, covered in dust but intact, were wooden crates. Sarah counted slowly. 12 crates, each about 3 feet long, marked with faded stenciling. They looked old, predating modern containers by decades. She knelt beside the nearest crate and brushed away dust. The stenciling became clearer. Property of Cascade Mining Kapwabor. Handle with care. 1923. 1923. A century ago. Someone had brought these crates here and left them. Why? What had been valuable enough to hide in a frozen volcanic crater? Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the nearest crate's lid. The wood was swollen but not rotted. She worked her pry bar carefully. The wood creaked, then gave way with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were more pieces of obsidian. But these weren't raw chunks. They were finished pieces, carved and polished, each wrapped individually and packed with precision. It was a sculpture, no larger than her hand, depicting some kind of animal. The detail was extraordinary. The obsidian carved so skillfully that light seemed to flow through the translucent sections. The piece was signed on the base. She unwrapped 3 more pieces, each unique, each showing the same craftsmanship. Not raw material, but finished art. The other crates held similar contents: sculptures, decorative pieces, jewelry, all carved from obsidian. Some showed the rainbow sheen. Others were pure black, polished to mirror brightness. A few incorporated silver wire or gold leaf. Sarah sat back on her heels. The chambers themselves were valuable, but these carved pieces suggested something more complex, a history she didn't understand yet. Cascade Mining Company, 1923. Sarah saved the name in her notes. This was research for later. For now, she needed to make decisions. The carved pieces were portable and individually valuable, far easier to transport than raw obsidian. But they were also clearly historical artifacts. Taking them meant removing pieces of history. Leaving them meant walking away from resources she desperately needed. Sarah thought about her daughters, about the eviction notice, about the choice between ethics and necessity. The choice felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of reality. She was already taking obsidian. The carved pieces were different in degree but not in kind, and they solved an immediate problem. She could transport sculptures far more easily than raw stone. She selected 6 pieces, choosing smaller sculptures that would fit in her backpack. Each one she wrapped carefully in her spare clothing. The remaining pieces she left in their crates, documenting their location with photographs. The climb back took longer, weighted by her pack and by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Sarah emerged into the crater, then stepped out into sunlight. The hike back to the SUV felt surreal. She was carrying artifacts a century old, worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sarah loaded her backpack carefully into the SUV's trunk. The canvas bag of raw obsidian went in next. She started the engine and began the journey back, her mind racing ahead to the meeting with Volcanic Collector. The drive to Portland took 5 hours. Sarah checked into a different motel, wanting no connections. In the room, she unwrapped 1 carved piece and photographed it carefully. The sculpture looked even more impressive in clear light. She spent an hour researching obsidian art from the early 20th century. Carved volcanic glass had been popular in the American West during the 1920s, valued for its novelty. Skilled artisans could command significant prices. But most of those artists were unknown now, their work scattered. The pieces Sarah found might be valuable primarily for craftsmanship rather than historical significance, which worked in her favor. She could sell them as vintage obsidian art without triggering questions about archaeology. Sarah drafted a new message to Volcanic Collector. I've acquired additional material. In addition to raw samples, I have access to several carved pieces from the early 20th century. Excellent condition. Would you be interested? The response came within minutes. Very interested. Bring everything Saturday. She closed the laptop and lay back on the motel bed. In 3 days, she'd discovered chambers full of valuable obsidian and found a cache of art hidden for a century. She'd made decisions that skirted ethical boundaries, and she'd positioned herself to potentially solve the crisis that had driven her here. She woke early Saturday morning, anxious. The meeting with Volcanic Collector was set for 10 a.m. Sarah dressed carefully, wanting to project competence. The coffee shop was crowded. Sarah arrived early and secured a corner table. She ordered coffee and sat watching the door. Volcanic Collector arrived on time. He was younger than expected, mid-30s, dressed casually in expensive outdoor gear. He scanned the shop efficiently, spotted Sarah's wave, and crossed to her table. "Sarah?" He extended a hand. "I'm Marcus Chen. No relation, I assume." Sarah shook his hand, startled by the shared surname. "No relation that I know of." Marcus settled into his chair. "So, Cascade Range Obsidian with rainbow sheen. You have samples." Sarah showed him the photographs of raw material. Marcus studied each image carefully. Sarah saw the slight tension in his jaw and knew she had his attention. "This is premium material," he said finally. "The color saturation is exceptional. Where exactly?" "Private property. I'd prefer not to disclose the location yet." Marcus nodded. "Fair enough. But I'll need provenance eventually if we're talking significant quantities. It's from land I own legally." "That helps." He paused. "You mentioned carved pieces too?" This was the crucial moment. Sarah reached into her bag and withdrew a small box. Inside was one of the smaller sculptures, a bird in flight, its wings spread in obsidian so translucent that light passed through like stained glass. She unwrapped it carefully and placed it on the table. Marcus went very still. He didn't touch it immediately, just stared with intensity. When he finally reached out, his movements were careful, almost reverent. He lifted the sculpture and held it up to the light. "My God," he said softly. "This is Cascade schoolwork. Early 20s, definitely. Look at the flow of the wing structure." He rotated it, examining from every angle. "Where did you find this?" "Same property as the raw material. There are several pieces, all similar quality." "Several." Marcus set the sculpture down gently. "Do you have any idea what you've got?" "I'm learning. That's why I'm here." He smiled slightly. Cascade School obsidian art is extremely collectible. Most pieces are in museums or private collections that never sell. He tapped the bird's wing. "A piece like this could sell for $15,000 to $20,000, maybe more at auction." Sarah felt her composure crack slightly. $20,000 for one small sculpture. She'd brought 6 pieces, left 6 more in the chambers. Marcus continued. "The question is provenance. Collectors want documentation. Can you provide that? The pieces were stored on the property when I inherited it. They're mine legally, but I don't have detailed history. That's going to limit your options somewhat. Major auction houses won't touch material without full provenance, but private collectors might be less concerned." He studied the bird. "I know several people who'd be very interested. I could arrange introductions, take a finder's fee on sales." "What percentage?" "Industry standard is 20%. Given the quality, I'd go as low as 15 if we're talking multiple pieces." Sarah did the math quickly. 6 sculptures at an average of 15,000 meant 90,000 in sales. Minus 15% left over 76,000. More than enough to solve her immediate problems. But it meant trusting a stranger, giving him access to artifacts worth more than she made in 2 years. Marcus seemed to read her hesitation. "I understand if you need time. But I'll be honest, material like this doesn't stay secret long. If you're planning to sell multiple pieces, you'll want someone experienced. Otherwise, you'll get taken advantage of." Sarah picked up the business card he offered. It listed Marcus as a geological consultant and specimen dealer. Professional credentials that might be legitimate. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course." Marcus wrapped the bird carefully and returned it. "But don't take too long. I have clients who've been looking for Cascade School work for years." The meeting ended with handshakes. Sarah sat alone afterward for 20 minutes, staring at the card and the wrapped sculpture. $76,000 if Marcus was honest. $76,000 if she was willing to trust a stranger. Or she could try to sell the pieces herself, fumbling through a market she didn't understand. She could contact official channels, archaeologists, or museums. But that meant permits and oversight and delays she couldn't afford with 23 days left until eviction. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "The girls are asking when you'll be home. Emma wants to show you her spelling test. Got 100%. Reality crashed back. While she contemplated $70,000 decisions, her daughters were waiting. Maya and Emma didn't care about provenance or ethical complications. They cared about whether their mother would finally stop looking so worried. Sarah picked up Marcus's card and typed a message. "I'm interested in moving forward. Can we meet Monday to discuss specifics?" The response came immediately. "Monday works. Bring as many pieces as you're comfortable showing." She sent back a confirmation and stood. The wrapped sculpture went back into her bag, heavier now with decision. She'd committed to a path that might be foolish or might be the solution she'd been seeking. The drive home took 6 hours. She arrived after dark to find the girls already asleep. Mrs. Rodriguez reported they'd been good. Sarah thanked her neighbor with sincerity. "You're going to be okay, mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "I can see it." Alone, Sarah unwrapped the bird sculpture and placed it on her kitchen table. It caught the light and seemed to glow from within. Someone had carved this 100 years ago, created something beautiful, then hidden it away. Now it sat between the eviction notice and a past due bill, waiting to be sold to solve problems its creator could never have imagined. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the art's value lay not in being preserved behind glass, but in actually helping someone survive. Sarah picked up her phone and composed a message to Jennifer. "Thanks for the offer to help. I think I found a solution for the deposit. I'll keep you updated." The response came quickly. "What solution?" "Sarah, what are you doing?" Sarah typed back. "Something that might actually work. Trust me." She didn't wait for Jennifer's reply. She turned off her phone and went to check on her sleeping daughters. Maya had kicked off her covers. Emma clutched her stuffed animal. Both peaceful, unaware of the decisions being made around them. Sarah stood in the doorway and made a silent promise. Whatever happened with Marcus, with the sculptures, with the obsidian chambers, she would find a way to give them stability. 23 days left. But for the first time since the eviction notice arrived, Sarah felt like maybe 23 days might be enough. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Sarah dropped the girls at school, watching them disappear through the gates, and felt the familiar clutch of anxiety. 21 days now. She met Marcus at a gallery in southeast Portland, a converted warehouse specializing in geological specimens. The owner, Diana Reeves, in her 60s, greeted Marcus with easy familiarity. She studied Sarah with sharp curiosity. "So you're the one with the Cascade school pieces," Diana said, leading them to a private room. Marcus has been quite excited. Sarah placed her bag on the examination table, acutely aware of her amateur status. "I hope they're what he thinks they are." Only one way to find out. Diana pulled on white cotton gloves and waited. Sarah unwrapped the first piece, the bird Marcus had seen. Then the others, one by one. A carved bowl with geometric patterns, a small figurine, a pendant with silver wire wrapping. 2 more sculptures, animals abstracted to emphasize the obsidian's natural banding. Diana examined each piece with methodical care, using a jeweler's loupe, measuring dimensions, photographing from multiple angles, making notes. Marcus stood back, letting the expert work. After nearly an hour, Diana set down the final piece and removed her gloves. "These are authentic Cascade schoolworks. Early 1920s based on technique and style. The obsidian is definitely local to the Cascade Range, and the quality is exceptional." She paused. "Where did you say you found them?" "On property I inherited. They were stored there, apparently forgotten." Diana exchanged a look with Marcus. These pieces would have been valuable when made. The fact that they were stored suggests the artist or owner had reason to preserve them. What are they worth? Sarah kept her voice steady, but her hands were clasped tight. That depends on several factors. Without documented history, we're limited to private sales. Diana consulted her notes. The bird sculpture, which is the finest, I'd value at $18,000 to $22,000. The bowl might bring $15,000 to $18,000. The figurine, $12,000 to $15,000. The pendant is particularly special, potentially $20,000 to $25,000. The two abstract pieces, $10,000 to $12,000 each. Sarah did the math automatically. Low end, $87,000. High end, $104,000. More money than she'd ever possessed. More than she'd make in 2 years. That's assuming we find the right buyers, Diana continued, which Marcus assures me he can do. I have several collectors who've been searching for Cascade schoolwork for years. How long would sales take? Sarah's voice came out rough. Depends on the buyer. If you need fast sales, we can prioritize the most desirable pieces with motivated buyers. You might leave some money on the table, but you'd have certainty. Sarah thought about the eviction notice, about the countdown that didn't care about optimal strategies. I need certainty. At least for some of the pieces. Diana nodded. The bird and the pendant will sell quickly. I can reach out to specific clients today. If they're interested, we could have offers by end of week. And your commission? 20%, split between Marcus for the introduction and my gallery for authentication and sale facilitation. Sarah did the math again. The bird at $20,000 and the pendant at $22,000 meant $42,000 in sales. Minus 20% left $33,000 and change, enough for the apartment deposit with money left over. Let's start with those two pieces, Sarah said, and we can discuss the others once I see how the first sales go. Marcus leaned forward. You mentioned there were more pieces where these came from. Same quality? Sarah hesitated. She'd brought 6 sculptures. Left 6 more hidden. Revealing the full extent felt dangerous, but Marcus and Diana were offering her a lifeline. There are additional pieces, yes, similar quality. I wanted to start conservatively. Smart, Diana said. But I'll tell you honestly, pieces like this are exceptionally rare. If you have access to more authenticated Cascade schoolwork, you should consider the long-term strategy. The conversation shifted to logistics. Diana would photograph the bird and pendant professionally, prepare detailed descriptions, and reach out to her most serious collectors. Marcus would handle background research, trying to identify the specific artist if possible. Sarah signed consignment agreements for both pieces, legal documents that made her stomach clench. But the terms were fair as far as she could judge, and both Marcus and Diana seemed genuinely invested in getting her the best prices. Still, she was handing over irreplaceable artifacts to people she barely knew. Walking back to her car afterward, Sarah felt untethered, floating between hope and terror. She'd just committed to selling objects worth tens of thousands of dollars, objects she'd removed from chambers that might have archaeological significance. If this worked, she'd have stability for the first time in years. If it failed, she'd have lost both the sculptures and any moral high ground. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. David is in Portland for business. He wants to take you to lunch. Talk about your solution. Tomorrow at noon. Sarah stared at the message, reading the skepticism in the quotation marks. Her sister had clearly shared Sarah's cryptic response, and now they were mounting a joint intervention. She typed back, "Okay, send me the restaurant address." That night, Sarah sat with her laptop and began researching the Cascade Mining Company. The search returned surprisingly little. A few brief mentions in historical archives about mining operations in the Oregon Cascades during the 1920s, mostly pumice and volcanic aggregate. No specific details about obsidian mining or art production. She expanded her search to include obsidian art from that era. The Cascade School Diana mentioned referred to a loose collective of artists working in the Pacific Northwest during the 1920s and early 1930s. They'd specialized in carving local volcanic glass, developing techniques that emphasized the material's natural optical properties. But most of those artists' names had been lost to time. Museums held a few authenticated pieces, which explained why Diana thought Sarah's sculptures would sell quickly. She wasn't just offering high-quality obsidian art. She was offering pieces from a nearly extinct tradition. Sarah found one intriguing reference in a digitized newspaper archive. A 1924 article from a Portland paper mentioned a mysterious fire at a Cascade Mining Company warehouse that destroyed valuable inventory, including geological specimens and carved artworks. The company ceased operations shortly afterward. Had the sculptures in the chambers been saved from that fire? The timeline fit. The pieces were dated to 1923 based on Diana's assessment. If they'd been moved to the volcanic crater in early 1924, that would explain why they'd remained hidden for a century. Sarah closed her laptop, mind churning. The property's history was more complex than she'd imagined. This wasn't just forgotten land with interesting rocks. It was connected to a regional artistic tradition, to a mining company that had vanished under mysterious circumstances. And her grandmother had somehow acquired it all at a tax auction. Had Helen known about the chambers, about the sculptures? Or had she simply recognized that land assessed at $1 might hide value? The lunch with David the next day was as awkward as anticipated. He'd chosen an upscale restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and prices that made Sarah's daily budget look like a rounding error. David Chen Richardson, always particular about his hyphenated surname, was a corporate attorney who specialized in mergers and acquisitions. "Jennifer is worried about you," he said once they'd ordered. "She says you've been making unusual decisions, driving to Oregon multiple times, refusing financial help, talking about some property solution that doesn't make sense. I inherited land from my grandmother. I'm exploring its potential." Land assessed at $1. David's tone suggested he'd done homework. In a remote location with no infrastructure. "Sarah, I've reviewed the property records. There's nothing there. Whatever you think you've found, I can almost guarantee it's not worth the time and money you're investing." Sarah sipped her water, buying time to control her response. "I appreciate your concern, but it's my decision to make. It's a decision that affects Maya and Emma. If you lose your apartment because you're chasing after a worthless property instead of accepting help, those girls are the ones who suffer." The waiter arrived with their meals, giving Sarah a moment. She wanted to tell David about the chambers, about the obsidian worth potentially millions, about the sculptures Diana said would sell for more than he made in a month. But revealing everything now, before the first sales were complete, would invite exactly the kind of interference she couldn't afford. David would insist on proper permits and archaeological surveys, environmental assessments and legal opinions, all of which would take months and cost thousands, and end with Sarah evicted while bureaucracy ground through its processes. "I'm handling it," she said finally. "Give me 2 weeks. If I haven't solved the apartment situation by then, I'll accept your help. But please let me try this first." David studied her face. 2 weeks. "But Sarah, if this falls apart, don't let pride stop you from calling. The girls need stability more than you need independence." The lunch ended with tense civility. Driving back, Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing down. Everyone in her life had decided she was incapable of solving her own problems. They meant well, mostly. But their certainty that she needed saving had become its own burden. Her phone rang as she parked. Marcus's number. "I have news," he said without preamble. Diana contacted 3 collectors about the bird sculpture. 2 have already responded with offers. Sarah's heart stuttered. Already? It's been less than 24 hours. Like I said, Cascade schoolwork is rare. These collectors have been waiting years. A pause. The first offer is $19,000. The second is $22,000. Both buyers are serious, cash available immediately. $22,000. Sarah said the number aloud, testing whether it sounded real. Diana recommends taking the higher offer. The buyer is a museum benefactor, completely reliable, and the higher price establishes a market baseline for the other pieces. Yes, take it. Excellent. The buyer wants to see the piece in person before finalizing, but that's standard. Assuming everything checks out, you'd have payment within 10 days. 10 days. Sarah counted forward on her mental calendar. That would leave 11 days before the eviction deadline. Barely enough time to transfer the money, pay the deposit on the new apartment, and move. But it would be enough. What about the pendant? Diana's still waiting to hear back from her primary contact. But she's confident it will generate similar interest. These collectors talk to each other. Once word spreads that authenticated Cascade schoolwork is available, you'll have multiple buyers competing. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her parked car and let the reality settle. $22,000. From one small sculpture found in a chamber no one knew existed. The fantasy solution David had dismissed was actually working. Faster and more successfully than she dared hope. But the success brought new complications. Marcus had mentioned that collectors talked. That word would spread. How long before someone started asking questions about where these pieces came from? Before a curious archaeologist decided to investigate? The property was registered in her name, easy to trace. And once attention focused on the volcanic crater, the chambers wouldn't stay secret. Sarah needed to move faster, extract more value before the inevitable discovery. But she also needed to be careful, avoid anything that would trigger legal problems before she'd secured enough resources to protect herself. The week crawled past with agonizing slowness. Sarah worked her shifts, came home to help the girls with homework, packed boxes for a move that wasn't confirmed yet, but felt increasingly likely. She exchanged daily messages with Marcus and Diana, tracking the buyer's due diligence process. On Thursday, Diana called with more news. The pendant has an offer, $24,000 from a private collector in Seattle. She's particularly excited about the silver work. She wants to buy it sight unseen. Trusts my authentication. That's higher than your estimate. Sometimes pieces exceed expectations when the right buyer sees them. This woman has been collecting Cascade schoolwork for 30 years. 2 pieces, $46,000 in total. Minus the 20% commission left Sarah with just under $37,000. More than enough for the apartment, for moving costs, for buying time to figure out what came next. Accept the offer, Sarah said. That evening, she allowed herself cautious celebration. She opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving and sat on her small balcony watching the city lights. 21 days had compressed to 7, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt like maybe she was winning instead of just surviving. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. This is Diana Reeves. I wanted to reach out personally. The response to your pieces has been extraordinary. I have 3 more collectors asking if you have additional works available. If you're willing to consign more pieces, I think we could generate significant sales over the next few months. Please consider it. Sarah stared at the message. She'd brought 6 sculptures from the chambers, sold 2, and still had 4 remaining. Plus 6 more still hidden in the crater. 10 pieces total, each potentially worth $15,000 to $25,000. Even at the conservative end, that was $150,000. Enough to not just survive, but to actually rebuild. But extracting the remaining sculptures meant more trips to Oregon, more time away from the girls, more risk of discovery. And each sale increased the chance that someone would start asking harder questions. Sarah typed back, "I have 4 more pieces currently available. I may be able to access additional works in the future, but I need to assess feasibility first." Diana's response came immediately. "Bring the 4 pieces to the gallery tomorrow. I'll photograph them and begin outreach. At this rate, I expect we'll have offers within days." Friday morning, Sarah called in sick to both her jobs for the first time in over a year. She drove to Portland with the 4 remaining sculptures, packed carefully in her trunk. The gallery was busier than before, several customers browsing the mineral specimens. Diana greeted her warmly and led her straight to the back room. The examination process was faster, Diana already familiar with the quality and style. She photographed each piece with practiced efficiency, made detailed notes, and then looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed professional excitement and personal curiosity. "You know there's going to be interest in the source of these pieces," Diana said carefully. "I can keep things discreet for now. But eventually, someone's going to want more information. Museums, academic researchers, maybe even government agencies, if they think there's historical significance. I understand. Do you?" Diana set down her camera. "Because I've been in this business for 40 years, and I recognize desperation when I see it. You need money quickly, and these pieces are your solution. I respect that. But whatever the story is behind these sculptures, it's going to come out eventually. Better to control the narrative yourself than have it exposed by someone else." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "The pieces came from property I own legally. I inherited them. That's the truth." "I believe you. But truth has layers." Diana softened slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you. I want these sales to succeed. But I also want you to be prepared for what comes after success. Visibility brings scrutiny. That's the trade-off." The word stayed with Sarah as she drove home. Diana was right. Each sale increased her visibility, created a trail that led back to the property. And once people started looking, the chambers wouldn't stay hidden. Someone would explore the crater, find the passages, discover what she'd found. At best, she'd face questions about why she hadn't reported the archaeological significance immediately. At worst, she'd face legal action for removing artifacts without proper permits. But what choice did she have? The eviction was real and immediate. The chambers were remote and unknown. She could protect her daughters now by taking calculated risks, or she could play by rules designed for people with resources she didn't have. The weekend brought chaos. Maya came down with a fever Saturday morning, high enough that Sarah spent hours in a walk-in clinic waiting for a doctor who ultimately diagnosed a viral infection and sent them home with instructions to rest and hydrate. Emma, sensing the disruption, grew clingy and tearful, needing constant reassurance. Sarah canceled her shifts, forfeiting income she couldn't spare, but unable to leave Maya with anyone else when she was this sick. By Sunday night, Maya's fever had broken, but Sarah felt like she'd aged a year in 48 hours. She'd missed 2 days of work, spent money on the clinic visit, and lost time she'd needed to plan next steps. The eviction was 5 days away. She'd signed the lease on the new apartment contingent on providing the deposit by Wednesday, but the payment from the bird sculpture sale hadn't cleared yet. Everything was cutting too close. Monday morning brought relief in the form of an email from Marcus. Payment received for bird sculpture, $22,000 transferred to escrow. Minus gallery commission, your net proceeds are $17,600. We can release funds to your account today if you provide banking information. Sarah typed her account number with shaking hands and hit send. $17,600. The first substantial money she'd earned from the chambers, proof that this wasn't fantasy but an actual solution. The deposit hit her account Tuesday afternoon. Sarah watched the balance update on her phone app, the number climbing from $217 to $17,817, and felt tears sting her eyes. It was real. The $1 property, the frozen crater, the hidden chambers. All of it had translated into resources that would keep her daughters housed and stable. She called the landlord of the new apartment immediately and arranged to deliver the deposit Wednesday morning. First month, last month, security deposit. Total of $2,100 that would leave her with just over $15,000 in reserve. More money than she'd had in savings since before her marriage ended. Wednesday morning dawned cold and gray, appropriate weather for endings and beginnings. Sarah drove across town to deliver the deposit check, signed the final lease documents, and received keys to an apartment that wasn't perfect, but was hers, and secure for at least the next year. Walking back to her car, she felt lighter than she had in months, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Her phone rang. Marcus again. "We have offers on 2 more pieces," he said. "The bowl brought $20,000, and one of the abstract sculptures got $18,000. Both buyers are ready to move forward immediately." That's faster than I expected. Word is spreading. Diana's clients are competing now, worried that someone else will get the pieces they want. It's driving prices up. A pause. There's something else. One of the buyers asked if you'd be willing to meet with an art historian who specializes in early 20th century Pacific Northwest work. She's writing a book about the Cascade School and would love to interview you about your grandmother's collection. Sarah's stomach clenched. I don't think that's a good idea right now. I figured you'd say that. But Sarah, this kind of academic interest is valuable. It adds legitimacy to the pieces, could increase prices even further. And it positions you as a serious collector rather than just someone liquidating an inheritance. I need time to think about it, of course. But don't wait too long. The historian is flying to Seattle next week. After that, she won't be back in the region for months. Sarah ended the call and sat in her parked car, staring at nothing. The sales were succeeding beyond her projections. 4 sculptures sold or pending, each generating more money than she made in 3 months. She had 6 more pieces if she needed them, plus access to the raw obsidian deposits worth potentially millions. But every success drew more attention. Art historians wanted interviews. Collectors were comparing notes. Someone, eventually, would start digging into the provenance more seriously. And when they did, the entire structure she'd built would face scrutiny she wasn't prepared for. Sarah pulled up the property deed on her phone and studied it again. The land was hers, legally acquired and properly documented. The chambers were on her property, which meant their contents belonged to her, at least according to basic property law. She hadn't stolen anything or trespassed anywhere. The sculptures had been sitting in storage for a century, forgotten by everyone who might have had a claim. But she also hadn't reported the archaeological significance to any official body, hadn't filed for extraction permits or environmental assessments, had actively concealed the source of the pieces from buyers and galleries. Each of those decisions made sense in isolation, driven by necessity and urgency. Together, they formed a pattern that could be interpreted as deliberate evasion. She needed legal advice, someone who could tell her honestly what risks she faced and how to protect herself. But lawyers cost money, and asking questions created records. Sarah had spent 2 years learning that official channels were designed for people with resources, and she'd only just acquired enough resources to consider accessing those channels. The week passed in a blur of activity. Sarah moved their belongings from the old apartment to the new one, a process that highlighted how little they owned after 2 years of downsizing and sacrifice. The girls adapted with the resilience of children, excited about new rooms despite being farther from their school. Maya asked insightful questions about why they'd moved, whether it meant Mom would be less stressed now. Emma just wanted to know if they could paint her new room purple. By Friday, they were settled enough that Sarah could think clearly again. She had 3 more sculptures waiting at Diana's gallery, offers pending on 2 of them. Her bank account held over $15,000 even after the move. The immediate crisis was solved, but the property still waited in Oregon, full of secrets she'd barely begun to understand. The chambers held 6 more sculptures and obsidian deposits worth far more than any of the art, and Sarah's initial desperate extraction had transformed into something larger, a situation that demanded strategy rather than survival instinct. Saturday morning, she received an email from Diana that changed everything. Sarah, I need to speak with you urgently about the pieces you've consigned. Please call me at your earliest convenience. This is time-sensitive. Diana. Sarah's hands went cold. She dialed immediately. Diana answered on the first ring. Thank you for calling so quickly. I have news, some of it good, some of it complicated. What happened? The art historian I mentioned, Dr. Catherine Mills, examined photographs of your sculptures yesterday. She's very excited about them. Says they're among the finest Cascade schoolworks she's ever seen. She believes they might have been created by Richard Ashford, one of the most talented artists from that period. That's good news, isn't it? More credibility for the pieces? Yes, but here's where it gets complicated. Dr. Mills ran the pieces past a colleague who specializes in artifact recovery. That colleague recognized certain characteristics of the obsidian that suggest it came from a specific geological formation in the Oregon Cascades, a formation that's been protected under state preservation regulations since 1957. Sarah's throat went dry. Protected how? The regulations prohibit commercial extraction of geological specimens from designated preservation zones without special permits. The rules are designed to prevent destruction of unique formations, but they also apply to historical materials found within those zones. The property is mine. I own it. I understand that. And Dr. Mills isn't suggesting you've done anything wrong. But she is concerned that if these pieces came from a protected formation, there might be questions about their legal status. She's recommending we pause any additional sales until you can provide documentation about the extraction site and any permits you obtained. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the careful structure she'd built begin to crack. What about the sales that are already in progress? Those should be fine. The buyers purchased in good faith based on our representations. But moving forward, we need to address the provenance issues more directly. Diana's voice softened. Sarah, I believe you when you say you own the property. But ownership doesn't automatically grant extraction rights for protected materials. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a larger problem. The call ended with promises to research the regulations and reconvene early the following week. Sarah sat on the floor of her new apartment, surrounded by moving boxes she hadn't unpacked yet, and tried to breathe through the panic. Protected geological formation. She'd never thought to check for preservation designations. The county assessment had called it resource preservation, but she'd interpreted that as generic zoning language. If the crater was actually under state protection, then everything she'd done, the extractions, the sales, even the initial exploration, might have required permits she didn't have. Sarah spent the rest of the weekend buried in legal documents and state regulations, searching for any information about her property's status. The process was frustrating and dense, layers of bureaucratic language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But eventually, she found what she was looking for. The Oregon Geological Specimen Protection Act, enacted in 1957, designated certain volcanic formations as state heritage sites. The regulations prohibited commercial extraction, but allowed limited collection for personal or educational purposes. More importantly, They included a grandfather clause. Properties that were privately owned before the regulations took effect were exempt from most restrictions, provided the owner could demonstrate continuous ownership or a direct chain of inheritance. Sarah's grandmother had acquired the property in 1987, 30 years after the regulations were enacted. But the tax auction documents indicated the property had been in private hands since at least the 1920s, well before the protection designation. If Sarah could trace the ownership history and prove continuity, she might have a legitimate claim to extraction rights that superseded the state regulations. She pulled up the property records again and began working backward. Helen Chen had purchased it in 1987 from the county after the previous owner defaulted on taxes. That previous owner was listed as Cascade Mining Company in receivership. Sarah's hands froze on the keyboard, the same company that had been stenciled on the crates in the chamber, the same company that had ceased operations in 1924 after a mysterious fire. The pieces were clicking together. Cascade Mining Company had operated the property in the 1920s, mining or processing obsidian and creating the carved pieces. Something had happened. The fire, financial collapse, or deliberate concealment that caused them to hide their valuable inventory in the chambers. The company had retained ownership for decades, but never returned to claim what they'd hidden. Eventually, they defaulted on taxes, and the property had gone to auction, where Helen Chen had acquired it for a nominal sum, which meant Sarah's inheritance wasn't random. Helen must have known something about the property's history, about its connection to the Cascade Mining Company, and the possibility that value remained hidden there. She'd held the land for 30 years, waiting for circumstances to align, and then left it to Sarah with no explanation because the explanation would have been dangerous to document. Sarah pulled up the email from Dr. Catherine Mills that Diana had forwarded. The art historian had included her contact information and a note expressing interest in learning more about the sculpture's provenance. Sarah stared at the email for a long moment, weighing options. She could ignore the historian, continue selling quietly, and hope no one asked harder questions. But Diana had made clear that was no longer viable. The pieces had attracted too much attention, and concerns about protected formations meant future sales would face scrutiny she couldn't deflect. Or she could engage directly with Dr. Mills, provide carefully curated information about the property's history, and position herself as a legitimate heir to a forgotten collection rather than someone exploiting archaeological resources. The second option was riskier in some ways, opening her up to questions she might not answer well. But it was also potentially more protective. If she could establish the property's ownership history and the company's original rights, she'd have a legal foundation that supported rather than threatened her activities. Sarah composed an email. Dr. Mills, I understand you've been examining photographs of sculptures from my grandmother's estate. I'd be willing to discuss the piece's history, though I have limited information about their origin. The property they were found on has an interesting connection to the Cascade Mining Company. If you're interested in exploring that history, I'd be happy to meet. Sarah Chen. The response came within an hour. Sarah, I would be extremely interested in meeting with you. The Cascade Mining Company is something of a mystery in regional art history. They produced exceptional work, but disappeared abruptly in the mid-1920s. If you have information or materials connected to them, it could be historically significant. I'm available this week at your convenience. Catherine Mills, Ph.D. They arranged to meet Tuesday afternoon at a cafe near the university. Sarah spent Monday preparing, gathering every piece of documentation she had about the property. The deed, the tax auction records, the county assessments, the photographs she'd taken of the chambers and the crates. She organized everything into a narrative that was true as far as it went, even if it left out certain details about timing and motivations. Dr. Mills turned out to be younger than Sarah expected, perhaps 40, with an energy that suggested genuine passion for her subject rather than academic obligation. She studied the documents Sarah provided with intense focus, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly absorbing information. "This is remarkable," Catherine said finally. "The Cascade Mining Company's assets were supposedly liquidated or lost after they ceased operations. But if they retained ownership of this property, and if the crates you found contain their work—" She looked up, eyes bright. "Sarah, you may have discovered the lost archive of one of the most important artistic movements in Pacific Northwest history. Is that good or bad for me legally?" Catherine's expression grew more serious. "It's complicated. The Obsidian formations you described would technically fall under state preservation regulations. But the company's prior ownership and your grandmother's legitimate acquisition create a strong case for extraction rights, especially since you're not destroying the formations, just removing materials that were already processed a century ago. So I can continue selling the pieces? I would recommend you work with state authorities to establish clear legal status first. File for recognition as a historical site manager, document the chambers and their contents properly. Then proceed with sales under appropriate oversight." Catherine paused. "I know that sounds like bureaucracy getting in the way of necessity. But trust me, doing this right protects you long-term. And it allows the scholarly community to study these materials, which has real historical value." Sarah listened to the advice and felt the weight of decision pressing down again. Catherine was offering her a path toward legitimacy, a way to transform her desperate extraction into something defensible. But it meant revealing everything, losing control of the narrative, and trusting that official channels would protect rather than punish her. "How long would that process take?" Sarah asked. "Depends on how responsive the agencies are. Could be a few months, could be longer." Catherine must have seen something in Sarah's face, because she added, "But in the meantime, the pieces you've already sold wouldn't be affected. That's done. And the remaining sculptures could be held in trust while the legal status is resolved. You wouldn't have immediate cash, but you'd have security." Sarah thanked Catherine and promised to consider her recommendations carefully. Walking back to her car, she felt torn between pragmatism and principle. The smart choice was probably Catherine's path. Document everything and work within the system. But the system had never worked for her before. It had been designed for people with stability and resources, people who could afford to wait months for official approvals. She'd solved her immediate crisis through careful risk-taking and calculated decisions that skirted official channels. Now she was being asked to surrender that independence and trust that authorities would treat her fairly once she'd exposed herself to their scrutiny. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Pendant sold. $24,000. Your net is $19,200 after commission. Should hit your account by Friday. Also, we have interest in the remaining 2 pieces. Buyer wants all 3 abstract sculptures if you have them, offering $60,000 for the set." Sarah stared at the numbers. $60,000 for 3 pieces. Combined with the sales already completed, that would put her at over $90,000 net proceeds. Life-changing money, enough to not just survive, but actually build something. But accepting the offer meant continuing down the path she'd started. Selling pieces without full legal clarity, hoping that her ownership and the historical precedent would protect her if questions arose. She thought about Maya and Emma, about the stability she'd promised them, about the apartment she'd secured, and the financial breathing room that was finally allowing her to think beyond next week's crisis. About her grandmother, who'd held this property for 30 years without explanation, waiting for someone who needed it enough to see past the obvious assessment. Sarah typed back to Marcus. "Accept the offer. I'll bring the remaining pieces this week." Then she opened a new message to Catherine Mills. "Thank you for your advice. I'd like to move forward with the documentation process. Can you recommend specific agencies I should contact and help me navigate the proper procedures?" Both messages sent. Two different paths, not contradictory, but parallel. She'd complete the remaining sales and secure the resources her family needed. Simultaneously, she'd begin the process of legitimizing her position, establishing legal protections that would support whatever came next. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't entirely safe. But it was strategic, using immediate opportunities while building toward long-term security. Sarah had learned over 2 years of crisis that perfect solutions didn't exist for people in her position. You took what you could get, protected what you could protect, and adapted as circumstances changed. The week unfolded with surprising momentum. Sarah delivered the final 3 sculptures to Diana's gallery on Wednesday. The buyer, a collector from Vancouver, examined them personally and confirmed the purchase on the spot. $60,000 for 3 pieces, processed and transferred within 48 hours. Combined with the earlier sales, Sarah's bank account now held over $87,000. It was more money than she'd ever possessed, more than she'd imagined having 6 weeks ago when the eviction notice arrived. Enough to change not just her immediate circumstances, but her fundamental relationship to the world. No more choosing between groceries and medication. No more lying awake, calculating whether she could afford new shoes for the girls. No more accepting help that came with judgment and obligation. Simultaneously, Catherine Mills connected her with an archaeologist at the State Historical Society, who specialized in industrial heritage sites. His name was Robert Chen, no relation. And his initial email suggested cautious optimism about Sarah's situation. He agreed to visit the property the following week to conduct a preliminary assessment and advise on the documentation process. Sarah arranged time off from both jobs, explaining that she was dealing with estate matters related to her grandmother. Both supervisors granted the leave without difficulty, and Sarah noticed that her requests were taken more seriously now that her financial desperation was less obvious. Stability, even new and fragile stability, carried weight that poverty never did. She rented the SUV again and drove to Oregon on Sunday, this time bringing printed maps and a detailed plan. Robert Chen would meet her at the property Tuesday morning. Before then, she needed to prepare the site, ensure the chambers were safely accessible, and decide what she would reveal and what she would keep private. The weather had shifted since her last visit. Early snow covered the higher elevations, making the final approach to the crater more treacherous. Sarah hiked carefully, testing each step, aware that she was now responsible for someone else's safety, as well as her own. She reached the crater's rim just as clouds began rolling in from the west, thick and gray with the promise of more snow. The chambers waited exactly as she'd left them. Sarah descended into the main space and began a systematic documentation, photographing every surface, measuring dimensions, creating the kind of detailed record that archaeologists would expect. The carved pieces she'd removed were gone, but their locations were still marked by the spaces where they'd rested in the crates. She documented those gaps carefully, creating a visual record of what had been found and removed. In the largest cavern, Sarah set up battery-powered lights and arranged them to illuminate the spectacular obsidian formations. She wanted Robert to see this space at its most impressive, to understand immediately that this wasn't just an interesting geological feature, but something extraordinary. She also made a decision about the remaining 6 sculptures. Rather than hide them or remove them, she left them exactly where she'd found them, still wrapped in their original packing, still resting in crates marked with the Cascade Mining Company seal. Let the archaeologist see them in context, undisturbed by her intervention. It meant surrendering immediate access and control. But it also demonstrated that she was willing to prioritize proper documentation over personal profit. Tuesday morning broke clear and cold, the storm having passed overnight. Robert Chen arrived precisely on time, driving a battered Jeep packed with equipment and wearing outdoor gear that suggested extensive field experience. He was in his 50s, weathered and competent, with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades solving complex problems in challenging conditions. "So you're the woman with the $1 volcano," he said by way of greeting. "Catherine Mills spoke very highly of you. Said you might have something interesting to show me." Interesting is one word for it. Sarah led him through the forest and up to the crater's rim. Robert stopped at the edge, studying the formation with an expert's eye. "This is a Mar crater," he said, "formed by explosive volcanic activity when rising magma interacts with groundwater. They're relatively rare in the Cascades. The state designated this as a protected formation in the 50s, though enforcement has been minimal given how remote it is. But the land was privately owned before that designation. Yes, which gives you certain rights, especially if you can demonstrate continuous ownership back to before the protection order." He pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "Show me what you found." The descent into the chambers took longer, with Robert examining everything methodically. He photographed the passage walls, noted the tool marks in the carved sections, commented on the obsidian formations with genuine appreciation. When they reached the main cavern, he went very still. "My God," he said softly, "this is extraordinary. I've never seen obsidian deposits of this quality in such quantity." He approached one of the massive formations and studied it closely. The coloration, the clarity. This is world-class material. The Cascade Mining Company obviously thought so too. Robert nodded slowly. They had operations throughout this region in the 20s, mostly pumice and volcanic aggregate, but clearly they recognized the obsidian's value. He turned to Sarah. "And you found carved pieces?" "In the sealed chamber at the far end, 6 sculptures remain. 6 others were removed before I understood the full historical significance." She led him through the final passage to the finished chamber, where the crates waited. Robert examined them with the careful attention of someone who understood immediately what he was seeing. He photographed the crates from multiple angles, documented the stenciling, then carefully opened one to reveal the wrapped sculptures inside. "These are masterworks," he said, unwrapping one piece with gloved hands. "Cascade school technique, absolutely. Probably Richard Ashford based on the style, though I'd need expert verification." He looked at Sarah. "Do you understand what you have here?" Catherine Mills suggested it might be historically significant. "It's more than significant. If these are Ashford's works, they're part of a lost archive that scholars have been searching for since the 1940s. He was the most talented obsidian carver of his generation, and most of his major pieces disappeared after the Cascade Mining Company fire." Robert's voice grew more animated. "We thought they were destroyed, but if they were hidden here instead, preserved in optimal conditions for a century, this changes our entire understanding of that artistic period." Sarah watched him examine the sculptures and felt the magnitude of what she'd stumbled into settling fully. This wasn't just valuable material or a financial solution to her problems. It was a piece of lost history. Work created a century ago by an artist whose vision had been preserved through accident or intention until someone finally found it. "What happens now?" she asked. Robert set down the sculpture carefully. "We document everything properly. I'll file a report with the State Historical Society recommending this site be designated as a protected archaeological resource. That designation gives you certain rights as the property owner, but also responsibilities. You'll need to work with approved researchers and follow preservation protocols. Can I still extract obsidian for personal use or small-scale sale? Within limits, yes. The designation protects the formations from wholesale destruction, but allows careful extraction of loose material or naturally fractured pieces. You'd need permits, and there would be oversight, but it's manageable. He paused. And the sculptures, those need to be properly documented and conserved. Some might go to museums, but as the legal owner, you'd retain rights to the collection and could negotiate terms. Sarah thought about the 6 pieces she'd already sold, the nearly $90,000 now in her bank account. What about materials that were already removed before the designation? Gray area legally. If you acted in good faith before understanding the historical significance, and if the pieces were sold to legitimate collectors, it's probably not actionable. But going forward, everything needs to be done by the book. They spent the rest of the day surveying the chambers systematically. Robert took hundreds of photographs, measurements, samples of the obsidian for analysis. He was particularly interested in the tool marks in the carved passage, suggesting they might reveal information about the company's operations and timeline. As they prepared to leave that evening, Robert stopped at the crater's rim and looked back. You know, people spend entire careers searching for sites like this. The fact that you stumbled onto it because you inherited a $1 property. He shook his head. That's the kind of luck archaeologists dream about. It doesn't feel like luck, Sarah said. It feels like responsibility. I needed money desperately, and I found this. Now I have to figure out how to do right by the history while still taking care of my daughters. Those things don't have to be in conflict. The Historical Society has programs that compensate property owners for providing access to significant sites. And if you work with museums on the sculpture collection, there are revenue-sharing arrangements. This could be valuable for you financially, while still preserving the history properly. They drove down the mountain as darkness fell, Robert already planning the next steps, Sarah trying to absorb the transformation of her situation. 6 weeks ago, she'd been facing eviction with $200 in the bank. Now she had financial security, a property that scholars called extraordinary, and a path toward legitimacy that might actually work. The following weeks moved with bureaucratic slowness, punctuated by moments of startling progress. The State Historical Society confirmed Robert's recommendation, designating the crater as a protected archaeological resource. Sarah received official notification that she maintained ownership and certain extraction rights, but that all future activities would require permits and oversight. Diana Mills facilitated an agreement between Sarah and 3 major museums regarding the sculpture collection. The 6 remaining pieces would be documented, conserved, and eventually displayed, with Sarah retaining ownership and receiving annual fees for lending them to exhibitions. The total compensation wasn't as immediate as direct sales, but it was substantial and ongoing, generating income that would support her family for years. The obsidian deposits required more complex negotiation. Sarah filed for a limited extraction permit, allowing her to remove naturally fractured material for personal sale. The permit came with restrictions on quantity and method, but it gave her legal cover to continue generating income from the property's resources. Through all of this, Catherine Mills became an unexpected ally. The art historian was writing a book about the Cascade School and wanted Sarah's story as a central chapter. Not the desperate extraction or the questionable sales, but the discovery itself, the preservation of a lost archive, the connection between Helen Chen's patient holding of worthless property and her granddaughter's eventual uncovering of its secrets. "Your grandmother must have known something," Catherine said during one of their meetings. The Cascade Mining Company defaulted on taxes in the late 30s, and the property went to auction multiple times over the following decades. Each time, someone bought it for almost nothing, held it briefly, then let it go back to the county. Like they'd looked for something, failed to find it, and given up. But my grandmother held it for 30 years. Exactly. Either she knew more than the others, or she simply believed that value existed even when no one could see it. Either way, she was right. Sarah thought about Helen Chen, a woman she'd barely known, who'd left her a $1 property without explanation. Had Helen discovered the chambers herself, found the sculptures, and chosen to leave them in place, waiting for circumstances to change? Or had she simply trusted that land dismissed by everyone else might one day matter to someone who needed it? She'd never know. But sitting in her new apartment with her daughters doing homework at the table, with financial statements showing balances that still felt surreal, Sarah felt a connection to her grandmother that transcended explanation. Helen had given her not just property, but possibility. A chance to solve her own problems rather than accepting help that came with strings attached. 4 months after finding the eviction notice, Sarah returned to the crater one final time before winter made it inaccessible. The site was different now, marked with official survey tags and safety equipment. Robert's team would return in spring to conduct a full archaeological excavation, documenting everything systematically. But for this visit, Sarah came alone. She descended into the chambers and stood in the main cavern, surrounded by glittering obsidian formations that had been dismissed as worthless by everyone who'd assessed this property for nearly a century. The sculptures were gone to conservation facilities and museum storage. The raw material extractions had been regulated and limited, but the space itself remained. Ancient and patient, indifferent to human valuations of worth. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperation that had driven her to accept a $1 inheritance, the determination that had pushed her to explore rather than accept the obvious assessment, the careful risks she'd taken, the ethical lines she'd navigated, the decisions made in crisis that had somehow led to stability. She wasn't proud of everything she'd done, removing the sculptures without proper documentation, selling them quietly to avoid scrutiny, concealing the source from buyers and authorities. All of it made sense in the moment, driven by necessity and desperation. But it also represented compromises she'd had to make because the system wasn't designed for people in her position. Now, with legitimacy established and security achieved, she could afford to reflect on those compromises, could acknowledge that she'd been lucky as much as smart, that things could have gone very differently. But she also understood that sometimes survival required accepting imperfection, taking the messy path because the clean one wasn't accessible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Mom, when are you coming home? Emma wants to show you her science project." Sarah smiled and typed back, "On my way. Tell Emma to wait. I want to see it together." She climbed back through the passages one final time, emerged into winter sunlight that made the snow-covered crater shimmer like diamonds. At the rim, she paused and looked back. The chambers below held secrets still, formations and history that would take years to fully document and understand. But they were safe now, protected and valued. No longer dismissed as worthless just because their worth wasn't immediately obvious. Sarah began the hike back to her vehicle, already thinking ahead. The spring would bring new opportunities, the possibility of careful obsidian extraction under proper permits, revenue from the museum agreements, perhaps even academic presentations about the site's discovery and preservation. She'd become, almost accidentally, a steward of something historically significant. Not the role she'd imagined when she'd opened that late-night email about Helen Chen's final asset distribution, but one that felt right nonetheless. The drive home took hours, but Sarah didn't mind. She had time now, space to breathe and plan. The eviction notice that had driven her to Oregon was ancient history. The apartment she'd been terrified of losing had been replaced by one she'd chosen deliberately. Her daughters were stable, thriving in their new school, no longer watching their mother calculate whether she could afford basic necessities. And in her bank account, a balance that represented not just money, but transformation. The $1 property had given her far more than its assessed value. It had given her agency, the ability to solve her own problems. It had given her connection to a grandmother she'd barely known, but now understood better. And it had given her a story, imperfect and complicated, about what happened when someone refused to accept the world's assessment of what she was worth. That evening, Sarah sat with Maya and Emma at their kitchen table, helping with homework and listening to excited descriptions of school projects. The sculptures she'd found were in conservation facilities, being studied by experts. The Obsidian formations were protected and documented. The chambers held their secrets more securely now, guarded by official designations and scholarly interest. But here, in this ordinary apartment with her daughters, Sarah held the most valuable treasure of all: the security to be present, to focus on homework and science projects, to make plans beyond next week's crisis, the space to be a mother rather than a survival machine, calculating and desperate. Jennifer called that night, voice cautious. "I heard from David that you met with some archaeologists about Grandma Helen's property. He said there might be something valuable there after all." "There was. There is. It's complicated, but it's being handled properly now." A long pause. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I thought you were being foolish, chasing after something that didn't exist. I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing." "I didn't know what I was doing," Sarah said honestly. "I was desperate and scared, and taking risks I didn't fully understand. But sometimes that's what survival looks like. You make the best decisions you can with limited information and hope things work out." "But they did work out." "This time, yes, but it could have gone very differently." Sarah thought about all the ways the discovery could have failed, could have left her worse off than before. "I got lucky, and I had help from people who didn't have to help me. That matters too." After the call ended, Sarah stood at her window looking out over the city lights. Somewhere in Oregon, a frozen crater held formations that had taken millions of years to create. Somewhere in museums, sculptures carved a century ago would soon be displayed for new audiences to appreciate. Somewhere in property records, a deed showed that Sarah Chen owned land assessed at $1 that had turned out to be worth far more than anyone imagined. But here, now, in this moment, Sarah held something simpler and more precious: peace. The kind that came from knowing that tomorrow wouldn't bring catastrophe, that next month's rent wasn't in question, that her daughters could be children rather than witnesses to their mother's constant crisis. The $1 property had given her that peace, and in doing so, it had proven something Sarah had needed desperately to believe: that value existed even when the world failed to see it, that dismissed things could matter enormously to those who needed them most, and that sometimes the most unlikely inheritance could change everything. She turned from the window and went to tuck in her daughters, ready for whatever came next, no longer afraid that one wrong step would destroy everything they'd built. The crater would be there in spring, patient and extraordinary, waiting to reveal more of its secrets. But tonight, Sarah was exactly where she needed to be, with exactly what she needed most: home. Secure. Hopeful for the first time in years. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.